Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, October 27th, 2023. All right, so this story just broke as I finished recording the full show. The U.S. launched airstrikes in eastern Syria. The Pentagon announced this on Thursday night, said that they targeted two facilities used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated groups. And this is a significant escalation that makes a regional war more likely amid Israel's bombardment of Gaza. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said in a statement that the strikes were in response to the series of rocket and drone attacks that have targeted U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria in recent weeks, which the U.S. is blaming on Iranian-backed militias, referring to the Shia militias that operate in the region. Austin said, quote, "These precision self-defense strikes are a response to a series of ongoing and mostly unsuccessful attacks against U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria by Iranian-backed militia groups that began on October 17th, end quote." So notice they're calling them self-defense strikes. That's because, this has happened before under Biden, that they did bomb these militias in eastern Syria and in Iraq, and they cite the Constitution as the justification for airstrikes in these countries, because claiming that it's self-defense of U.S. troops, even though they're stationed in these countries, especially in Syria, where the government doesn't want them there. They're occupying the eastern part of the country. So the U.S. has said that Iran is responsible for the attacks on U.S. troops, although the Pentagon has acknowledged that it has no evidence Iran directed them. The Shia militias are also known to act independently. Recently, a U.S. official actually told CNN that how willing these groups are to act independently of Iran is a persistent intelligence gap for the U.S. So that's them basically saying they don't know how often they will just act on their own or if they're acting on behalf of Iran. So the point here is that the U.S. doesn't really know if Iran is directing these attacks or not. So just keep that in mind, because you're going to see the hawks, try to drum up war with Iran. So the increase in attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria was due to President Biden's support for Israel's onslaught on Gaza. And now, again, I've said that this has happened before, where Biden bombed eastern Syria or Iraq, targeting specifically, the Shia militias. And usually it's a flare-up that happens over some rocket attacks on U.S. bases. The U.S. bombs them, usually kills a few dozen. Right now, this is Thursday night. No reports about the casualties. I'm sure that'll become clear on Friday. But what usually happens in these flare-ups, the U.S. bombs them. They might fire some more rockets, but if no U.S. troops get killed, then maybe the U.S. stops the bombing, or the U.S. launches some airstrikes again, and then that's it. Somebody backs down. But I think the situation, what I'm worried about is, I expected that the U.S. was going to do something like this, and what I'm worried about is that they're not going to back down this time because of what's going on with Gaza, because of how much Israel's bombing Syria. I mean, there's just so much going on now that I think a lot of these groups that want the U.S. out of Iraq and out of Syria might really ramp this stuff up this time. So we'll see how this all plays out. But earlier in the day on Thursday, the Pentagon said that it was deploying an additional 900 troops to the Middle East as part of its plan to bolster air defenses in the region. So U.S. troops based in Iraq and Syria have come under rocket and drone attacks over a dozen times since last week, resulting in at least 21 injuries. And Brigadier General Pentagon spokesman Pat Ryder, he said that 19 troops had been diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries. So again, we'll see how this develops, but I'm concerned that this is a big escalation that is going to just send things into a more of a spiral in the region. I mean, things are just so bad right now that this could really turn into something. So Hopefully I'm wrong and maybe it'll cool down, but I just don't expect that to happen. But anyway, that's it for this story. So here's the rest of the show where I was oblivious of the U.S. bombing Syria. So enjoy it and have a good weekend. All right, so the next one here, Israeli tanks and troops briefly enter Gaza during a raid. So the Israeli military said Thursday that Israeli tanks and troops briefly entered the Gaza Strip overnight in a limited raid to prepare the battlefield as Israel is expected to launch a full-scale invasion soon. The military said that the raiding force engaged with Hamas fighters and took out anti-tank weapons during the raid, which only lasted a few hours. An Israeli military spokesman said the troops operated within 1 kilometer of the border and that no Israeli soldiers were hurt. The spokesman said, quote, "Through the raid, we eliminated terrorists, neutralized threats, dismantled explosives, neutralized ambushes in order to enable the next stages of the war for the ground forces," end quote. So I haven't seen what Hamas said about this possible raid, but the Israelis are saying that they didn't lose any troops or anything. So this raid came after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed that Israel would launch a ground incursion into Gaza, but did not say when. Media reports have said that Israel agreed to delay the invasion until the U.S. is able to send more air defenses to the region, and that's part of what that deployment of 900 troops is about. So the Israeli airstrikes have just continued to pound Gaza. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, now over 7,000 people have been killed in the bombardment, including nearly 3,000 children. And we'll get into more about the death toll in another story here. But the next one, Ron DeSantis says that Florida is sending weapons to Israel. That's right, the state of Florida is sending weapons to Israel. So this article is from AP. So Florida Governor Ron DeSantis said Thursday he's arranged to send drones, weapons, and ammunition to Israel as it prepares for an incursion of Gaza in response to the Hamas attack. And it is the latest official response that DeSantis has taken to back Israel as he competes in the 2024 Republican presidential primary. So Florida has sent cargo planes with healthcare supplies, drones, body armor, and helmets, said Jeremy Redfern, who's a spokesman for the governor's office. The state also worked with groups to supply unspecified amounts of weapons and ammunition that were privately funded. The governor's office said that it acted at the request of Israel's consul general in Miami, so that this consul general, so this Israeli official in Miami, initially said that he did not request drones, body armor, or helmets, nor had he talked to the governor about getting weapons or ammunition through private parties. But then he said later on Thursday that others in the Israeli government had communicated with DeSantis' office to determine what would be sent. So DeSantis is extremely pro-Israel. He goes over to Israel sometimes and signs legislation for his state of Florida in Israel. It's very strange. You can't imagine a governor doing it for, another country. I know the last thing, he signed some new anti-Semitism law, and they used that, and he just ordered some universities to dismantle these pro-Palestinian groups. Florida is one of the countries that has the anti-BDS laws that's against boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is an international movement designed to pressure Israel through boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And so if an American company boycotts Israel, the state of Florida can take action against them. And they actually did that when Ben & Jerry's, Ben & Jerry's is based in Vermont still, but they're owned by Unilever, which is a British conglomerate. But when Ben & Jerry's said they would stop selling ice cream in illegal Israeli settlements, Florida was one of the states to take action against them and divested Unilever funds from their pension funds and things like that. So these anti-BDS laws, are very, totally go against the Constitution and our First Amendment rights. Another form that they take is for if contractors are entering a contract with the state, they have to pledge that they'll never boycott Israel. So there's been some lawsuits out of it. So I know that they toned down the fines. There was a substitute teacher in Texas who was Palestinian, and lost her job because she refused to sign a contract that said she would never boycott Israel. So there's laws like this in over 30 states, and the Israeli government lobbied to get these laws passed. So anyway, DeSantis is very pro-Israel in a lot of ways, and this is just another example of that. And I'm sure part of his campaign is going to be, especially with this war, is going to be being very, staunchly pro-Israel, although the polling still shows, that Donald Trump is way ahead of him. But he is the second. He's in second, but by a pretty wide margin. All right, so the next one here, Republican senators introduce a standalone Israel aid bill. So a group of Republican senators have introduced a bill that would give Israel $14.3 billion in additional military aid to support its onslaught on Gaza, separating the funds from the $105 billion request from President Biden that includes funding for Ukraine, Taiwan, and border security. So this bill was introduced by Senators Roger Marshall, J.D. Vance, Mike Lee, and Ted Cruz. It would provide $10.6 billion for Israel through the Pentagon, $3.5 billion for the State Department's Foreign Military Financing Program, and $200 million to help protect U.S. diplomatic facilities. And this is on top of the $3.8 billion that Israel receives from the U.S. each year in military aid. So this is about the same amount that Biden requested, about $14 billion in that huge spending package that he's requested that includes the Ukraine, Taiwan, and all the other stuff. So these senators want to separate spending for Israel from Ukraine so additional military aid can be sent to Israel as quickly as possible. President Biden's request includes $61 billion for Ukraine, and that's designed to fund the war in Ukraine for a whole year. So Senator Marshall said in a statement, quote, "My colleagues and I firmly believe that any aid to Israel should not be used as leverage to send tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine. Any package that does so would result in funds and resources being delayed in Israel's time of need. The legislation we've introduced provides the aid to Israel requested by the Biden administration and should be considered by the Senate immediately," end quote. So the U.S. has already shipped additional military equipment to Israel using funds that they had and deployed all that firepower to the region. So we'll see how this goes. I know Senate leadership like Mitch McConnell is all about Biden's $105 billion request. So it's just a matter of what I think the Republicans overall are thinking on this, if this bill gets a vote, and if this is the route that they choose to go. I know in the House, there's, I think, more Republican opposition to the full package, and they would rather just pass the Israel aid standalone too. But we'll see how everything plays out. All right, so the next one here, Gaza's health ministry gives names of the Palestinians that have been killed. So the Gaza-based Palestinian Health Ministry released the names of thousands of Palestinians killed during Israel's onslaught since October 7th, and this came after President Biden questioned the death toll. So according to the health ministry, at least 7,028 Palestinians have been killed, including 2,913 children. The report that it released listed the names, ages, genders, and ID numbers of 6,747 people. And it says an additional 281 bodies have not yet been identified. So I actually linked to this report that they published. It's in Arabic, but you see, you could scroll through all the names and, you see all the ages. So it's quite a big list. It's not loading for some reason, but it's there if you want to go check it out. So this came after when Biden was confronted about the child casualties in Gaza. He said that he had no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth, while also recognizing that innocents have been killed, which he said was the price of war. So Ashraf al-Qudra, who's the spokesman for the health ministry, said that the U.S. was devoid of human standards for shamelessly questioning the death toll. He said, quote, "We decided to go out and announce with details and names and in front of the entire world the truth about the genocidal war committed by the Israeli occupation against our people," end quote. So Biden and other U.S. officials have cast doubt on the casualty numbers since the enclave is ruled by Hamas, meaning that they have oversight of the health ministry. But Gaza's health ministry is known to be reliable, and its numbers have stood up to UN and even Israeli scrutiny in previous wars. And I know this guy, the spokesman, Al-Qudra, according to AP, he's based at the Shifa hospital and receives data from all the other hospitals that's kind of meticulously entered at the hospitals and morgues, and he collects it all and then he puts it out. So that's how they say it's done. And but anyway, back to the numbers. So one example that I put in here was, the last really big conflict in Gaza. I mean, there's been decent flare-ups since this. Excuse me, sorry. 2014 was really the last big one, and the Gaza's health ministry said in the 2014 war, 2,310 Palestinians were killed, and the UN did their own count, and their number was 2,251, so just slightly lower than Gaza's health ministry, and Israel's estimate was 2,125, so a little less than the UN, but still pretty close to that final Palestinian death toll. And again, look at what Israel's doing. I mean, if you look at, there's been satellite images going around of these neighborhoods before and after just being completely leveled. And they say that this is a low death count. This is what Gaza's health ministry says, because there's still people trapped under the rubble. They haven't put everybody in. Some people were buried right away and didn't make it to a hospital or a morgue, so they're not included. And again, just the sheer number, Israel said they dropped 6,000 bombs in the first 6 days. If they kept up that rate, that means they're up to 18,000 bombs by now on Gaza, which is so densely populated. So anyway, so while President Biden is questioning the death toll, a report from HuffPost found his State Department is citing the figures from Gaza's health ministry internally in cables known as situation reports. So in the State Department, diplomats are talking to each other and writing up these reports on the situation in Gaza. They are using these numbers. And in one of these reports, which was written on October 21st, the State Department official drafting the cable noted that the casualty rate could actually be higher than what Gaza's health ministry is reporting. This report said, quote, "The numbers are likely much higher according to the UN and NGOs reporting on the situation," end quote. So, I mean, even if, let's say, the death toll is being exaggerated, I don't think it would be by much. Again, if you just look at the sheer destruction of what's going on. And, there's a lot of on Instagram, you could see a lot of videos. There's one journalist in Gaza. There's a few, but one who is usually speaking English and putting out a lot of videos. I mean, you just see what he walks through these neighborhoods, and it's just devastation. He comes across bodies of children, pretty frequently. And this is just one guy, so, again, it's just very clear that a lot of people and a lot of children are being killed, but the U.S. is just trying to, forget about it and deflect it. All right, so the next one here is an interesting one. This is from the Times of Israel, and it says that Israeli surveillance soldiers warned of Hamas activity on the Gaza border for months before October 7th. So the brutal Hamas massacre on October 7th was preceded by months of warning signs noted by IDF surveillance soldiers and disregarded as unimportant by intelligence officials, according to eyewitness accounts given in recent days. At least 3 months prior to the attack, surveillance soldiers serving on a base in Nahal Oz reported signs that something unusual was underway at the already tumultuous Gaza border, situated a kilometer from them. So the activity reported by the soldiers included information on Hamas operatives conducting training sessions multiple times a day, digging holes and placing explosives along the border. According to reports of the soldiers, no action was taken by those who received the reports. So essentially, this is more evidence that the Israeli government did receive warnings that something was coming, and that they didn't take any action to prevent it. The Egyptians said that they warned them something big was coming, and now we have this. And this is Israeli media, and if you read Israeli media, I read the English language versions, but you have Haaretz, Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post. They are all very critical of the Netanyahu government for this attack and everything. And he's not politically. This is not good for him. It's very different than 9/11 was in the U.S. Like, everybody kind of rallied around George W. Bush, but that's not happening here with Netanyahu. All right, so the next one here: displaced Gazans head back north after finding south no safer. So this article is from AFP, and it's just one kind of anecdote about a woman who was in the north, was told to evacuate to go south, went south, and was still bombed and lost members of her family. Sorry, where am I here? So her name is Sakala, and she said, "Wherever we go, we will die," as she prepared to leave the city of Khan Yunis in the south of the territory to return to Gaza City with her surviving child. She is among roughly 600,000 Palestinians UN officials have said fled south in response to Israel's warning to evacuate for your own safety. And when she fled to the south, her husband and 3 of her children were killed in Israeli airstrikes. I mean, just horrific. And now just by herself and her one surviving child is heading back to Gaza City, because where else are they going to go? They don't feel safe in the south. And you see some people that they quote in here say that they would rather just die in their own home, instead of sleep in tents on the street and be killed there. So again, it's just, you see these pictures and you hear these stories. It's just clear that there's this mass slaughter going on in Gaza. All right, so the next one here, $150 million weapons package for Ukraine. So don't forget about the Ukraine proxy war. The Biden administration on Thursday announced a new weapons package for Ukraine worth $150 million. That includes ammunition for HIMARS rockets, air defenses, artillery rounds, and other equipment. The weapons are being provided under the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows the U.S. to send weapons straight from Pentagon stockpiles. The $150 million is being pulled from funds made available by a Pentagon accounting error that overvalued previous weapons sent to Ukraine. So earlier this month, the Pentagon said that it still had $5.4 billion in drawdown funds available from the money freed up by the error. Based on the weapons packages that have been announced since then, the Pentagon has about $5 billion left to ship weapons to Ukraine until Congress authorizes more. So according to the Pentagon, the equipment in the $150 million package includes munitions for the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, AIM-9 missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, HIMARS ammunition, the 155mm and 105mm artillery rounds, TOW missiles, Javelin anti-tank systems, more than 2 million rounds of small arms ammunition, night vision devices, demolition munitions, cold weather gear, and spare parts and things like that. So the Pentagon also released a fact sheet on Tuesday that said the U.S. has committed $43.9 billion in military equipment for Ukraine since Russia invaded in February of last year. And Congress has authorized a total of $113 billion to spend on the war. That also includes economic aid, money for the Pentagon to replenish weapons, funding for troop deployments in Eastern Europe, and there is other types of spending mixed in there. So Biden has requested $61.4 billion in additional spending on this war. All right, so the next one here, Slovakia says Europe should not supply arms to Ukraine. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The new government of Slovakia has followed through with its campaign pledge to terminate arms transfers and is calling on the rest of Europe to adopt Slovakia's policy. Slovakia's new leader, Robert Fico, has called for the European Union to take on a peacekeeper role in the Ukraine war, and Slovakia will not support further sanctions on Moscow. So he told members of Slovakia's legislature on Thursday that Slovakia was abandoning the West's proxy war against Russia. He said, quote, "I will support zero military aid to Ukraine. An immediate halt to military operations is the best solution we have for Ukraine. The EU should change from an arms supplier to a peacemaker," end quote. So significant that a NATO member has a government that is all in on cutting off Ukraine completely and not playing the game at all. He also said that Slovakia would not support sanctions, and the question is if that's really going to have an impact on the EU sanctions and stuff. All right, so the next one here: Ukrainian pilots have begun training on F-16s in Arizona. So the U.S. has started training Ukrainian pilots on how to fly F-16 fighter jets in Arizona this week, marking another step toward arming Kiev with U.S.-made warplanes. So an Air Force spokesperson told Air and Space Forces magazine that a small number of Ukrainian pilots are training with the 162nd Wing of the Arizona Air National Guard in Tucson. The spokesperson did not give a definitive timeline on when the training will be completed, saying that it will take several months. Foreign F-16 pilots also need to take English lessons, which Ukrainians started last month in Texas. So when President Biden first approved the plan to arm Ukraine with F-16s earlier this year, it was sold as a European-led effort, but quickly it turned into the U.S. kind of taking over. Training classes did start in Europe in August, but soon after that, the Pentagon said that the U.S. would also start training pilots inside the U.S., and so far the Netherlands and Denmark have pledged to give F-16s to Ukraine, but it will still take some time until they can be used in battle. The U.S. has left open the possibility of providing its own F-16s, which will probably become much more likely if Congress authorizes this new $61 billion in funding for Ukraine. All right, so the last one here, the Senate votes down a bill to withdraw from Niger. So the Senate on Thursday rejected a bill that would have directed President Biden to withdraw all U.S. troops from Niger, where a military government has been in power since a July 26 coup that removed former President Mohamed Bazoum. So the bill failed overwhelmingly in a vote of 11 to 86. So it didn't do very well, but this resolution was led, it did get bipartisan support, what little support it had. The resolution was led by Senator Rand Paul and co-sponsored by Senators Mike Lee and Roger Marshall. If you notice, it's interesting, it's Republicans. These are all Republicans that sponsored the bill. But Mike Lee and Roger Marshall, they also sponsored the bill to give, billions in military aid to Israel. So the 8 other senators who voted in favor of the bill include Tim Kaine, Democrat, Bernie Sanders, Independent, Peter Welch, Democrat, James Merkley, Democrat, John Kennedy, Republican, J.D. Vance, Republican, Ed Markey, Democrat, and Mike Braun, Republican. So a pretty good mix of Republicans and Democrats there. So the U.S. has about 1,100 troops in Niger and a major drone base in the country known as Air Base 201. The Biden administration recently formally declared the events of July 26th a coup, meaning that the U.S. can no longer provide military assistance to the junta, but there's no sign the U.S. plans to withdraw. So France began withdrawing its troops from Niger after the post-coup government, which is led by General Abdelrahman Chiani, demanded the French leave. So far, the junta has not asked the U.S. to exit the country, and there has been reports that the U.S. is considering a waiver to allow continued cooperation with Niger's military. So if you remember, I was covering Niger quite a bit because the ECOWAS, which is the bloc of West African nations, they were threatening to intervene in Niger, and it looked like if they did, it was going to be backed by the West, by the French and the U.S. That hasn't happened. I haven't seen them threatening to do much lately, but the sanctions are still in place on Niger, and the people in Niger, they're really having an impact on them. But I think there's still the chance, but it's not clear what the U.S. is going to do here. They are considering, from the reports, some sort of waiver, so they could just keep doing business with the Niger military, which I wouldn't be surprised if that's what the U.S. decides to do. I can't see them wanting to give up this big drone base that they have there, and other assets that they have in Niger. But that is it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Alex Lowe. America is the danger and will end up getting us all killed. One from Edward Lazansky. One time when Biden was right. One from Patrick Eddington. When speech is terrorism, the legal and political assault on Stop Cop City. One from Ted Galen Carpenter. South Korea would be prominent casualty in a U.S.-China conflict. And our spotlight is written by Connor Freeman and Scott Horton. Netanyahu's support for Hamas has backfired. And this is, there's just a lot of background on the situation in Israel with Hamas and Netanyahu, and there's a lot of stuff packed in here. Just good background information if you want to check that out. But that is everything for me for today. That's it for me for the week. Hopefully my voice wasn't too annoying. I'm very stuffed up and still sick, but I'm feeling better. But anyway, you can always help the show by sharing it, commenting. I appreciate everybody that comments on YouTube and Rumble. You can like, subscribe, tell your friends about the show, and I appreciate everybody that tells me that they are sharing this. Tell them about antiwar.com and what we're trying to do. I'll be back tomorrow. Not tomorrow. I'll be back after the weekend. But anyway, thanks for listening.